And we're live. Well, welcome everyone once again to We Are the Builders Australia. And once again, I'd like to welcome Helen and also another comrade we've had on the show before, but I've known him now for at least a good 3 years, is Joe Montero. Welcome to you both this evening. How's things in Melbourne?
Very good, thanks. Yep.
They are. Yeah, and there's even sunshine these days.
It was actually. I was in Melbourne yesterday. It was a beautiful day. Then I had to go down the state office there, and just said I want to pop out to get some lunch. I thought it was very lovely weather down there. Look, it's also tonight. Nate will try and join us. He's just having some technical issues with his computer. Hopefully, he might be able to jump on later on. But before we proceed, I just also to acknowledge that. I actually will put this broadcasted from the land of the Judge Roaring, and I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present and future, and also acknowledge that the struggles of the First Nations initially started off as an anti-colonial struggle against invasion, and obviously has now developed along with the broader class struggle, or a higher struggle against imperialism. Black and white unite to fight, because I don't think we've got much choice in that matter, and we need to actually now garner all the anti-imperialist forces together, united as one. Well, on tonight, we're actually now we're still currently discussing and studying Peru Libre, and we're on tonight on chapter 9 on culture and tourism. And what we usually do, we usually read one or two paragraphs each. I actually might ask Helen to kick it off, and then once we read through one chapter, we'll obviously have a discussion, then we move on to the next one. So over to you, Helen.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Dave. So we're on culture and tourism tonight, and that's chapter 9, as Dave said. National tourism is the best parameter to see if a society is moving towards development or not. Peru is one of the countries with the greatest archaeological treasures in Latin America, infinity of traditions and customs. However, we have not reached the optimal use of these benefits that would undoubtedly result in the improvement of living conditions in our country. In reality, in the country, there is no state policy oriented and determined to promote tourism in a planned manner, without the need to privatize our diverse patrimonies to national and international capital. Unfortunately, the few advances in this matter correspond to the partial state effort and the private investment of the private entrepreneur. We have almost all ecological altitudes and floors, an immensity of pre-Inca and Inca cultures on the coast, mountains and jungles. A vast history of struggle and heroic passages in the forging of our independence, diverse landscape and climates, since our country is considered by the UN as the summary of the world geography, immense variety of flora and fauna, archaeological ruins, sanctuaries and historical centres, among others, that we do not put in value before the world, and we are waiting for some foreign businessman to be interested in it. Do you want to go, Dave?
Yep, no worries, I can do that. The Peruvian state must guarantee the dissemination of culture in all media, raising the level of identity of our society, preventing us from being victims of alienation. A basic element for economic, political and cultural colonisation. To achieve this objective, we must agree with the media to promote local, national or international tourism, which must be inextricably linked to promoting, knowing and interpreting our Amazonian Andean culture. The capital cities of the regions and provinces do not all have museums or theatres, and if they do, the passage of citizenship or educational institutions through them is not promoted. A dynamic activity is not printed on them, and to this added to scarce resources for tourism and culture. Joe, do you want to go next? I'll mute you. Hang on, Joe. I've just got to unmute you.
Ready to go?
Yep.
Okay. Tourism culture should be encouraged, which implies hard work of promotion, elimination of mistreatment of tourists, the inhospitable nature of some towns due to inexperience in this area, excessive charges for services, and increases in tickets under the justification of the free market. citizen insecurity, and the low historical cultural level promoted by a neoliberal education, which conspire against this important sector. National patrimonies must continue to be run by the central government, but what concerns regions and provinces must be fully decentralised to their governments. On many occasions, they are the central government bodies that prevent initiatives by subnational governments for development of culture and tourism, from bureaucratic obstacles to imposing and onerous fines. Likewise, we must promote tourism in native communities, respecting ILO Convention 169, of which Peru is a member. So its agreements have the force of law, guaranteeing the defence of our languages, culture, customs, traditions, and the conception of a world properly of the original communities.
Wow, that's really that's quite interesting, isn't it? When we think of Australia and our Indigenous communities, how do we think this could work? Is tourism a progressive thing? Well, and I think the fact that they were saying that it's within the control of the state and not within the control of private business is what maybe differentiates it between being progressive and exploitative of Indigenous populations. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I was thinking what I was looking at this. I think it's where they've actually also too got to properly control the tourism sector. The simple reason, you can have over tourism, which actually causes a lot of ecological damage. Great Barrier Reef's a classic example, but I've seen that overseas where they're just quickly pumping tourists into everything from affecting marine life to natural fauna and flora as well, and they have to build more resorts, more hotels, etc. It actually properly regulates it, because what is under the neoliberal free market role, it's so unregulated. You've got unscrupulous tourist operators, but on top of that, it's also the effect on the local environment, and also too the local communities as well suffer. Welcome, Nate.
I think
technical issue.
Hey, everyone. Sorry I'm late.
I think Australia's a bit, I suppose I don't know much about too many other countries, but we do have some level of state management and control, because every state has a tourism board, their regional equivalents as well. I don't think in Australia that's the problem. The problem is more like it's the state, the type of state we got, and the priorities of the state, rather than whether it's the state or not. I mean, yes, there's the private sector operating under that. Even the private sector operates under certain regulations in certain places. But the emphasis is not on actually developing a new culture. The tourism gets around and actually preserving the environment and so on. It's about making business.
Yeah, it's also about putting Indigenous. Yeah, that's right, Joe. It's also about keeping Indigenous communities, under economic pressure, so that they have to basically exploit their own communities, their own holy sites, their own architectural sites for the purposes of tourism. I think a good example we have here is Uluru, where recently they've had to close. The possibility up of actually climbing to the top of it, and of course that is a deeply historic and holy site, sacred site for First Nations people. But the fact that they, we opened it up to tourism and all that kind of stuff is basically just one element of the exploitative nature of our tourism industry, and it's probably a good thing that they were able to influence the government to close that down. But you can imagine in other parts of the world with other Indigenous cultures that they'd be under even more pressure to be able to make some money the only way they can, and that is tourism. And it does participate in the destruction of their culture and their holy sites and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think one good example overseas is the Mapuche people in southern Chile. They've the states come in because they've been fighting for their rights. They're particularly in the Patagonian part in the south, and they've militarized. They've militarized the area. So they've sent in the military now just in the last couple of weeks, and they've arrested a lot of their leaders because they're complaining too much. They want too much. But the indigenous people are complaining that mining companies ours are coming in and actually destroying their traditional lands and their holy sites.
That's right. And the fact is also on the impact on culture. I mean, Brazil's also another one that's is equally guilty as anyone else. And Bolsonaro, the president, is actually very hostile to its indigenous people. But a lot of them would either be pushed off the land for tourism ventures or cleared off the land for clearing the Amazon or for other things as well, for mining interests and pastoral interests. But I've seen that actually, within Brazil, they actually moving the indigenous out of the way for tourism to prosper even more. And I just wanted to add on something too. I was just thinking to tell you, but we had prior to COVID, I mean, obviously we had these monster cruise ships all on our oceans and stuff, fit up to thousands of people on it, and they're just floating islands of diseases anyway. But you could just imagine, 3,000 to 4,000 people come off, and COVID was a classic example, like what happened in Sydney when they just disembark, and next thing you know, they're spreading diseases like that. So if it's happened to be in an indigenous community nearby, that could decimate their population too. So that just comes to show you what they're trying to do here in Peru is a completely different way of doing things. And putting it out of control is to by all means come and see it, enjoy our culture, respect it. And instead of like being one that's used to exploit the local culture, exploit the people and the environment. Another classic case of exploitation is very near to us, Southeast Asia. The amount of people that go overseas and live like kings on other people's misery, and also too the sex industry or sex trades a whole lot. It's rife. It's actually outright should be outright criminal. What goes on there, but the fact is, when we were all reading through this, and I thought, well, look, this is one country is showing an example, so we can get control of the situation very quickly, and this is what we want to do, and make sure it's properly regulated. And no, you just can't come into our country and just do whatever you like and just go wherever you like. You've got there's certain, you've got also to show some respect for law, the nation's law, sovereignty, and also its people as well.
I think,
Sorry, George. So there were just two things in there that really struck me was the description of for one they call it tourism culture, which is slightly different from just purely holidaying or going somewhere to have a cheap holiday. And I think that we could manage to do that as well as have a tourism culture which really promotes and shows the indigenous population, and the fact that they were talking in here about the capital cities of the regions and provinces, they don't all have museums or theatres, and that's something that could be promoted in indigenous communities and so on, is museums and cult and theatre particular to their area, and because as we know, Australia's indigenous communities diverse, 250 different languages. So, previously, so that's something that could be promoted within that realm of tourism.
Yeah, I think there are, this whole thing about connection between tourism and culture and identity. I mean, one site we do have in Australia, it's not Indigenous as such, Sovereign Hill. We all know Sovereign Hill, Victoria, which, again, there's a very good aspect to it because it promotes the history of the place, the struggles of working people, and so on. But it's so commercialised, you need to be just about wealthy to afford the ticket to go in. That was one thing. It's got to be available. It's got to be, people can't get ripped off. A tourism industry that rips people off defeats the purpose. So, it should be free or nominal charge to get into somewhere like Sovereign Hill. Same thing at other places. There are other places like that in Australia where it's a good thing that the history's been preserved. You've got that in Bendigo as well, haven't you?
Yeah.
But it's how it's managed, the thing. And the other thing with the culture side, it's about building our identity as a nation, as a people. And that's sort of, I'm glad to be. Yeah, I'll just say, I think the US is parking their Air Force in your backyard or something. But that's what it sounds like anyway. But it's how it's applied. And there, what is the purpose other than actually a few people making a lot of money off culture and tourism?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That's key.
And I found too, and Nate probably Nate will probably no doubt understand this. Like, for example, like another tourist thing. I mean, Sydney's New Year's Eve. It's usually a big world-renowned event now. The fireworks. I've been there a number of times, but now they've got so many areas all closed off. You have to pay to get in, where it used to be free to. And basically a lot of the tourism things, what they've done to cities like Sydney, Melbourne to a degree, but all the capital cities, it's turning into, and any other good areas, all the nice areas are turning into a for the very wealthy. So if you want, say for example, New Year's Eve, Sydney. If you want now a good spot, you have to pay up not just like a few dollars. You'd be paying up hundreds and hundreds of dollars to get somewhere, and it's all taken up all these events and everything else. For the general public, good working people, they'll be crammed into a few spots near the base of the Harbour Bridge or a few other places if you're lucky. Otherwise, you're going to have to go and watch on a big screen somewhere or go completely elsewhere if you enjoy that sort of thing. And it comes to show you that the tourism market only favours those with a lot of money and not those who are just generally the common people. It's basically how they'll push working class people and Indigenous people off there in order to have these live events. I mean, it should be that event every year. I mean, well, it's what people's views of it are, but it should be opened up to the public in general. It should be everyone should be enjoying. But no, because I mean, it's a blessing and curse that Sydney's a harbour city. Well, the fact is, the curse is it's a rich man's playground. Sorry, if you don't have the money, you're not going to enjoy it. We'll leave a little spot here and there for you if you try and cram in. Everywhere else, nope, you got to pay.
Yeah, that's totally true, Dave. I can probably add my own experience to that. Is that I think, especially in the last few years, for anyone who's familiar with Barangaroo here in Sydney, there have been, I think, the last few consecutive New Year's Eves, they've been charging, I think, upwards of $500 for entry into the park there at Barangaroo, which does have a beautiful oceanfront view of the harbour. As will do other places around the city, but this place is I wouldn't say that much expensive than anywhere else, even that $500. And I think that only entitles you to entry plus maybe one or two drinks, which obviously you can't leave outside of that area with them. And not only that, but now that it is considered for all intents and purposes private property, naturally you've got the police there to make sure that whoever gets in has got the required passes and has actually paid for them. So as we see, the repeated duty of the police there is to protect the private property, and the segregation of public places to make profit.
Exactly. And I think, oh, sorry, just on that, and I just say. Go on, Joe. Sorry. Yeah, go on, Joe. Sorry, mate.
I think I just drew a memory because I've been around for long enough to remember there was a time when on these special days were times when local communities got together and they basically took over the street and they kind of had a bit of a party, a bit of a celebration. Didn't cost anybody anything. But they're there, it was amongst their neighbours. And that was important as part of the culture because it was one of the aspects where people got to know the people who lived around them. And one of the things of our culture now, because it's become so commercialised, we've been chopped off from each other. How many people actually know the names of their neighbours on both sides?
Yeah, I'm probably a bit too young to remember, but I do recall a lot of stories from my parents who were talking about cracker night. Used to be a regular
Oh,
occurrence.
yeah,
I'm sure you guys are familiar with it.
That was the
And they
best
used, to,
night of the year.
they used to be full of stories about like, oh, that neighbour down the street, we know that person, we know that person around the block, and all that kind of stuff. Just put up a massive bonfire. And look, obviously there was safety issues. How could there not be? But it's just I always was a little bit jealous hearing about those stories and about the camaraderie and the amount of new friends that you'd make and how close the community would feel. So these kinds of situations, these kinds of events are important, and tourism is also important to meet new friends from around the world and all kinds of stuff. But again, we have to separate it from that kind of exploitative system that we've got here.
Yeah, each street used to compete with their bonfires, see who could build the best bonfire. We'd spend a day or two. Everybody spent a day or two building the thing. And it was a massive competition. And if you were up in the sky, if you could get up there, on the night, there'd be all these fires, masses of them all over the place. And the whole city was having a great time.
Yeah.
And they were making their own entertainment. I did get injured once. I got burnt. I got a firework shoved into my foot. One of these flare things, and made a hole there. But that aside, there were a few injuries.
Look, I had a little burn. I remember the parachutes that used to shoot up there and they explode, boom, and everyone, all these house kids used to run and try to catch the parachute, come down. Both one was still hot. I caught it in my hand. Christ, it hurt. And I was like, and for a 9-year-old boy, that was certainly an honour. Yeah. At the time, but it's
we used to shoot Roman candles at each other. They were dangerous, mate.
Yeah. Oh yeah, all the Tom. I won't try and incriminate myself, but the jumping jacks and Tom thumbs, like in school.
But they had these huge bungers. They could just about blow a finger or two off. They used to throw them at each other as well. And those young blokes, the jumping jacks, we used to like to throw them at the girls.
Yeah,
get them screaming.
Or the Tom thumbs. Yeah, little Tom thumbs. Just had the federal cops and state cops.
Okay, this is a beautiful reminiscing of a time gone by. Yeah. But we do have to move on.
Yeah, no worries.
I think the importance of it, though, is that it did help to build communities, and it was a culture, a part of the culture, and it brought people together.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly did. And actually, Comrade Pinko just made it interesting. They still have fireworks day in Northern Territory as well. So, at least there's one place they probably haven't killed it off. The fun police haven't come along and killed it off. So, yeah. Hey, welcome to Comrade Pinko. He just want to mention that he actually does his own YouTube channels, and I believe he's been on Ewoks Unhinged a few times as well. So, please shoot over to his YouTube channel and subscribe to it, share it far wide. He does some good analogies as well. So, welcome aboard, Comrade. Well, what we'll do, we'll read through the next chapter on chapter 10 on decentralisation. Nate, did you want to kick it off?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Here we go, chapter 10.
And everyone else, we just put ourselves on mute, so just to cut any background noise.
Okay. In the civilised world, decentralisation is a form of democratic organisation constituting a permanent, compulsory, dynamic, irreversible, democratic, integral, subsidiary and gradual policy of the state. Its purpose is to align exclusive, shared or delegated powers to subnational governments, avoiding duplication of efforts and optimising economic resources. In our country, decentralisation is paralysed and worse, still conspired by government centralism as bodies have been created parallel to regional governments, duplicating functions, re-centralising powers, administratively working, maintaining bureaucratic castes, outsourcing their own jobs, and promoting the privatisation of state institutions. The aim is to structurally disappear the regional governments and, to avoid the crisis, to have the parallel bodies active as immediate substitutes. Someone want to go next?
Helen, do you want to go next? You're on mute.
Okay, decentralisation of the Ministry of Economy and Finance. The Regional Directorate of Economy and Finance must be created in each department. The MEF is the only ministry that has not been decentralised in the form of direction to the regional governments, unlike the rest. And this is the reason for the failure of fiscal and tax decentralisation. If there is no economic autonomy, there is no real decentralization or future federalization. Since there are several regions in the country that contribute a huge amount of money to the national treasury, however, the real figures and their destinations are unknown because the neoliberal state handles it with absolute secrecy. Although the contribution from the regions is high, these regions show extreme poverty figures, such as the case of Huancavelica and Cusco, with respect to the Mantaro hydroelectric plant and Camisea gas, respectively, which have contributed nothing to the development of the communities where they are settled. Federal Republic and Constitution of Federal States. As in any civilized democracy, for the peoples to enjoy what is provided by nature, decentralized autonomy is necessary, and it achieves its maximum peak when it becomes a federal republic. This implies a broad political, administrative, economic, fiscal, tax, legal, police, road, decentralization, etc., which turns regional governments into federated states, being the first and last instance in making decisions corresponding to their jurisdiction, allowing only in express case the intervention of the national level. Fiscal and tax decentralization. Currently, the central government collects 98% of fiscal taxes, municipalities 2%, and regional governments 0%. In the federated states, this reality would drastically change. The subnational governments would have the power to record and collect taxes, of which they could administer up to 70% of it, 40% regional, and 30% municipal, and 30% of the collection must be transferred to the central government for governing and control policies of the state. Joe, do you want to continue, or Dave?
Joe, can you go next? No, you're on mute.
Yep, I've just sorted that out. Wrong one. Okay, opening, I think that's where you ended up, opening of the savings banks or regional financial institutions. Regional governments must be authorised to open regional savings banks as municipalities have. However, in the state that allows and protects the private monopoly of large banks, this becomes unfeasible due to the possibility of noticing competition. Worrying the regional savings banks would be an economic and financial alternative for our peoples by granting loans to the most vulnerable sectors with credit facilities and low interest rates. This noble end is conspired because we are facing a neoliberal state that prevents the emergence of state banking, and the explanation is because the international banking established decades ago enjoys exclusively in the market benevolences that the current constitution protects and imposes the rates of higher interest rates, making incalculable profits and exploiting the people. Recognition of the plurinational state, the Peruvian state has to recognize that we are a plurinational country, a fundamental condition for drawing up state policies and ending the uninational centralist segregation against the peoples of Peru profunda. This tool is important because it allows the conscience of all Peruvians to create the new society, identifying general and specific objectives according to the peculiarity of each people. Elimination of the centralist state. For many years to the present, the central government continues to assign the 70% of the budget, leaving 18% for the 25 regional governments and 12% for the 4,385 municipalities. This arbitrary distribution is then expressed in the economic opulence that some cities have and the extreme poverty of others, making the inequality gap between social classes widen and more difficult to close. Eliminate minister. Yeah, actually, would somebody else like to take over this point?
Yeah, I'll do this one. Start off. It goes, eliminate ministerial bodies parallel to regional governments. The Ministry of Education Menendu, is in charge of the National Program for Educational Infrastructure, a unit in charge of the identification, execution and supervision of public investment projects. In reality, it is a functional duplicity. The regional governments execute works of hundreds of millions of souls and have demonstrated sufficient technical capacity to carry them to fruition. In reality, they want to continue maintaining a bureaucratic caste that, in the end, outsources its duties to consulting firms and has the final objective of privatising education, since by function to promote the participation of the private sector in public education, financing and executing investment projects, as they intend to build the high-performance colleges in Junín and Pasco, Junín, Cavallica and Cusco, or through the public-private associations, granting them for 20 years. As one more example of re-centralisation in the education sector, we can name the government's intentions for regional directors to be appointed by a tripartite court between the regional government, Severe, and Menendu, where centralism has 2 votes to 1. Thus, they proceeded to give themselves the legal licence to appoint the directors of the a faculty that had already been decentralised, simulating a public contest and hindering regional governance. Nate.
The Ministry of Health, or MINSA, is in charge of the National Program for Investments in Health, or PRONUS, another body parallel to the regional government, as it has the power to formulate, execute and supervise investment projects for all levels of complexity, when in reality, regional governments can carry out these tasks without much difficulty once the budgets have been transferred. As in PRONEED, it is only to maintain the bureaucratic caste dedicated to outsourcing its work and with clear purposes of privatising public health, having hospitals built by APP or delivering them through concessions, as was intended to be done with the Regional Institute of Diseases. Neoplásicas de Concepción built the socialist Junín regional government. The Ministry of Transportation is in charge of the special project for national transportation infrastructure, Provías Nacional. But at the same time, Provías Decentralizado, our question is whether its existence is justified despite the fact that the regional governments each have their regional directorate of transport and communications, since in reality it is a parallel body endowed with a millionaire budget to carry out works of regional competence. This shows that the national government does not want to lose economic control of the country's highways, preferring to maintain this bureaucratic caste in the administration in order to hijack the regional budget and concession departmental highways. The Ministry of Agriculture has the largest number of parallel bodies, such as the OPA, the public assigned bodies, INIA, SENASA, ANA, SERFOR, and Sierra y Selva Exportadora. Also, the programs Agoriades, Subsectorial Irrigation Program, PSI, and Agro-Rural. Also, they drive 10 special programs among them regarding Junín, Sierra Centro Sur, and Desarrollo del Valle de los Ríos Apurímac. I'm really sorry for the pronunciation, by the way. and Mentaro. It is not that it is intended to disarm the Ministry of Agriculture, as we can show that in addition to the aforementioned parallel bodies, they handle important executing units such as Sierra Azul, Rediagro, Crop Information System, and the Agrarian Statistics Information System, all with a millionaire budget. In a centralised country, these programs should not be in charge of the ministry, but of the Regional Directorate of Agriculture of each regional government. The Ministry of Labour and Employment Promotion created the National Superintendency of Labour Inspection, or SUNAFIL, and expanded its powers to re-centralise the functions that had been decentralised years ago to the regional governments. When SUNAFIL intervened in the departmental jurisdictions, the powers of supervisory control in the labour area were taken away from the regional governments, with which the Regional Directorate of Labour and Employment Promotion became simply a promotion office. To all this conspiratorial work of the parallel bodies, it is added that the regional directors receive a ridiculous remuneration of 3,500 soles per month, while those in charge of the parallel bodies can earn up to 20,000 soles.
Challenges of decentralisation. As regional governments demonstrate a good command of their governmental powers, they must demand the total transfer of greater powers, for example, over the medium-sized mining companies and possibly later on the large mining company. Transfer of powers to control logging, framework of autonomous bids without a central dependency of the state procurement supervisory agency, full transfer of special projects, decentralization of social security, decentralization of the administration of sports infrastructures, creation of the regional directorate of economy and finance in all regions, transfer of fiscal and tax domiciles of the companies to the regions of the place of operation and exploitation of the wealth, urban land titling, and not only in rural areas, but in the urban area, and maritime law of the coastal regions over the territories, sea, etc. Wow, that's a lot of information to understand. So if I can just kick off the discussion with trying to understand what decentralization means for a country, I guess from what I take from this is that rather than the central government having all total control over everything, the way to control things for the regions is to decentralize things so that the regions have more of a say over all of the things that the central government is controlling. So all of the things like schooling and housing and income taxes for that region and so on. But then my question would be, how does that affect areas that maybe don't have mining in it? How do those areas, the poor areas, how do they get funding, if you like, or an income?
Yeah, that is a good question. I feel like the actual distribution of finances themselves aren't really addressed here, and more so, given the actual autonomy is more focused on. So I guess in that situation, I can imagine a situation where it's you have your regional centres that are autonomous and have a huge degree of independence in terms of crafting their own legislation and stuff like that is particular to their regions or provinces. But then in terms of like financing and budgetary requirements, I'm sure that there can also be other mechanisms that are more centrally sort of controlled and distributed and maybe subsidised from one region to the other. Yeah, I wish there was more information there, or where they were a bit more specific as to how they would finance and how that distribution goes. But that is a good question.
But I think one thing that it did mention in there was that they did have percentages, and they talked about the municipal area having 70%, and that they would then so they would keep 70% for their own local area, and then 30% of the collection must be transferred to the central government for the governing and control policies of the state. So I suppose that extra 30% could then be distributed to areas that needed it. If you had a government that was, of course, caring about the people.
Yeah, I think China actually does that as well.
Yeah, I think they were talking about, it went a bit further. There was actually a very quick reference to decentralising tax collection as well. So the regional area actually collects the tax and then remits some upstairs to the central government. So, and that's a big difference compared to what we have in Australia. I think there's the other aspect that came out clearly to me. If we look at Australia's example, we've got a federal government, we've got 7 state and territory governments, and we've got a stack of municipalities. And there's been a long history that if any of them gets into a bit of strife, it's a bit unpopular, it's quite easy to pass the buck. It's not our fault. Take the response to COVID, particularly New South Wales and the federal government. Who was responsible? We had that in Victoria too. So there's been this long history of duplication, not knowing where one starts and the other one ends, and control over municipal government in the sense that the state governments and territory governments control the funds, basically. And have a lot of power over them. So in a sense, we're over-governed centrally. Yeah. Australia, you have to say.
Good. Also, sorry, Joe. Keep going.
So it's a question of maybe if we had applied that sort of outlook to Australia, we'd look at strengthening local government, in a sense, making it more financially autonomous. I mean, it's only part of the answer, but that would perhaps fit into line. If we're talking about Indigenous people, what about an autonomous government for them, for Indigenous communities, First Nations?
Yeah. It also makes those autonomous governments a lot more responsive because they have less of a population base to have to accommodate. So instead of having this big, bulky, bureaucratic nightmare that is, centralised and then spreads down afterwards, is you've got little sections here which can do their own thing, and then little sections here which can do their own thing, and they don't have to worry about what the rest of the polity has to sort of, what those needs are, because they'll be taking care of their own autonomous regions.
Yeah. I mean, I'd assume that even in Peru, there'd be some things like power generation, for instance, and so other major infrastructure projects would still have to be fairly centralised. So that's not completely out of the picture. Yeah. But those things that can be handled locally.
Well, I look at something like geographically in our country, I mean, not geographically, but how we look at look at example, the relations with the states and the Commonwealth. I mean, you had COVID, but you also, the other thing, GST is a classic example. All that goes to the federal government or Commonwealth government, and then or even you could distribute to whatever to each state. Now, when I was living in WA, Western Australia, the act is there's always been a big fight between, regardless who forms government over there, be it Libre or Liberal, but fighting the Commonwealth for an extra share of the GST. And they've got a bigger population over there than, say, Tasmania that gets a bigger share of the GST than what WA does. And, it's all this uneven distribution for what's based on what's needed and everything. And the thing is, when states are granted extra money from the Commonwealth, the fact is it comes with all these political deals that go with it, or political, what do you call it? There's a word, political, these things attached to it. And, so basically saying, well, no, if we want this extra thing, you're going to do what we want you to do, basically, and not actually thinking, well, the state government says, well, we need the money to do this, this, and this, but you're actually holding us a politically ransom to do something completely different if we don't get this money. And, it certainly is not a harmonious relations at all. And that as well. And I think when I was reading what they were trying to do in Peru here is to make a harmonious relations between the provinces and their national government. So who's delegated to do what? That's okay. You're delegated with certain powers. We're delegated with such, and this is how and everyone has input in the planning and everything else. It's not so much like a top-down scenario as what it shows here. And I don't think in Australia here, what's interesting, they're going on about this neoliberal free market. Everything's individualised and everything's free. Well, it's not. It's pretty heavy-handed top down when you think about it.
I was going to pick up on that point, Dave, that you were mentioning about the top down, but it's also by decentralising government, it means that grassroots organisations can develop, and it gives them power to control the community's destination, and it also creates a much more democratic society, because if you've got decentralized finances, then and communities are much more involved in where the money's going to go and how they're going to use it, and their taxes are paying for things in their community, then people become much more harmonious, and those grassroots organizations can really develop and take control, and so therefore you have way more democracy because people are distributing the wealth amongst themselves, and that's crucially important. I had a colleague of mine today talking to me about a psychology course he did, and he said that he was doing criminality in it, and he thought that it was going to be about low-level criminals and what we all think about in terms of criminals, who they are. And of course, what it turned out to be was actually about the powers of the elite, the ruling class, really, and them being able to organise huge corrupt schemes and rip-offs of the community and so on. And so he was really surprised that was in the course. But it brings to mind the fact that because everything's centralised in the hands of the government, they then are able to make laws that across the board we have to obey, and they can be corrupt, and there's no decentralization there. So I think all of those things sort of meld in together, the democracy side of decentralizing things and the economic side of decentralizing things as well.
Exactly. Well, has anyone
That's a
got
great
any...
point.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, that's a great point, that, because I think it does allow local communities to develop their authority over their own affairs. And I think that's basically the definition of democracy. But it's also a lesson to some of the assumptions we have that everything's got to be organised at the middle. And there has been a habit in society of thinking in those terms. Sure, there's some of that, but where possible to get that down, to develop, and I think developing a democratic economy and democratic power down on the ground is the way forward. And that's what needs to be encouraged. It looks like very much in that document, really the sort of, behind the words is kind of that type of attitude. That's really what it's linked to.
Yeah. And I really like the part where they talk about regional banking. So regional governments must be authorized to open regional savings banks, so that that once again stops the monopoly of large banks. And what we're seeing here in Australia is that, rather than having more regional banks, we have, and these are only offices or but we're having the offices of banks closed down, and so more and more the money is being centralized in the cities. Our local little towns and that no longer have access to banking, and so that once again that creates that monopoly competition as well.
Just to mention, there is a living example is in the Basque Country of Spain, Mondragon. Many people have heard that, but they've got this whole town and the region around it. They've got a federation of cooperatives. That whole area runs that way. They have about 80,000 workers involved, and they run factories, export. They run the shops, all the shops. They've got their own bank. They've got their own university. They've got a couple of secondary schools and some primary schools. Everything's run the same way. And they guarantee jobs to everyone. They guarantee an income to everyone. So, if something which a few years ago, one of the factories had to be shut down, but they found a job for everyone within their federation. So they're financially independent. Now, when the country went into economic decline like the rest of us, a few years back, the statistics show that was the most successful part of the whole economy, the whole Spanish economy. The biggest factory exports builds white good fridges, washing machines, and that, and they're actually trying to help other countries do it. And I've learnt that they've signed a major deal to open a big version of that in China. Actually, they're about to build it. So they've reached an agreement with the Chinese government, and that's going to happen. But it is a great example. Not only that, it is. If people like it, if they don't like it, but it's quite a highly politicized region. I mean, most people, they know what they're about, and they're Basques as well, so they've got that bit of that outlook. But it is an example, and it's actually having an effect around the world. People are learning about it, and it was set up by a priest as well, who actually nearly got shot during the dictatorship. He was accused of being a communist, and because he had connections in the church, he didn't get the firing squad. They pulled him out just in time.
Nate, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, to summarise both yours and Joe's point, I think when it comes down to Australian communities, I think a lot of us, we always have a lot of concerns when it comes to our tax money and what it's going to be used for and stuff like that. And typically the biggest criticism we always make about government spending programs is, oh, they're wasting our money, our taxpayers' money, blah, blah, blah. Well, if that's the case, if we have more regional governments, more autonomous, given more autonomous power to our own regional governments, we as Australians will be able to see more directly and concretely how our money is being spent, how our labour output in terms of the profit that's generated gets spent with our own eyes in our own communities, in our own regions. And what's more democratic than that? When you're talking about democracy, you're talking about how the people's will is being expressed. And if you can see your own will as a worker being expressed by having infrastructure projects be funded, by having housing be constructed, by having healthcare being fulfilled, by having trains, high-speed trains being implemented, how is there any more democratic system? For anyone that's watching, I think that's something that we need to have food for thought and just to think about.
Yeah. And it's also, too, I think it's also the form of, this is why I just want to bring up the issue of alienation. Like, for example, I live in a region, I live in Bendigo, but I've been in places like Mildura and that, and you feel so far removed from Melbourne, what's actually going on, all the decision-making and that. And really, by rights, we're only limited in what, we're very limited in the control of what's been, or actually any input of what the decision-making is made in Melbourne. For example, you mentioned high-speed rail. Now, I'll give you a classic example. Right, there's a big campaign for many, many years in Mildura to reinstate the passenger railway line that was closed down by the Kennett government in the early 90s. But that was their main connection to Melbourne for many years. And it took about close to a day to get into Melbourne, I think about 8 hours, but it's usually like that by car as well. But the fact is they don't have one. You have to jump on a coach or B-line coach, and they're still campaigning. Now, for something like high-speed rail, and they have the local community up there, and Mildura is not a small little town. It's quite a big place and growing area as well. And it would be ideal that they'd have the money to invest in it, put a high-speed rail line from Mildura to Melbourne, and also Mildura to Adelaide as well, because they're about the same distance to Adelaide as well, so they get the advantage of both worlds. And this is but I think the general frustration people have in regional areas, they've just got no control of it. This is what's happening. Things we need the services, we need this, we need that. Oh no, we've got to put this money into something completely different and nothing to do with our area. And I think it's. I did have once a bit of a dash at a local member of parliament about where I live. You're talking about you're doing all these great things in other places and everything. What about Bendigo again? Well, I do a lot for Bendigo, rah. And I was, well, in the scheme of things, no. This is your local area. You're thinking about everywhere else, but bar here, and like Bendigo itself, it's in central Victoria. We're pretty much close to the central point. You can go anywhere. And you think geographically, it's in a perfect location. So you think, oh yeah, we can actually develop this region further to do this. And then you look at towns like Shepparton, Mildura, and all the other areas, and they too can have. We can look at to have them develop further so they can carry out what they can do. But it's just what we're just seeing is all the decision making, and you're quite right, all the wealth being extracted to the major capital cities.
Yeah, just if I could go back to something I suppose relate back now that you mentioned the Kennett government. Back in the 90s, I was involved in a school that decided to run, the school community decided to run the school when the government decided to close it down. At Richmond. I ended up being appointed as a de facto school principal. And one thing, there were two things about that is when, as far as we developed a lot of contact with regional centres and, country people, a lot of them, and they fought hard and they gave us a hell of a lot of support, because, and they were National Party strongholds. They weren't exactly left-wing, but they were people who actually over the years fought for the services they had, and they saw a government closing down what belonged to them. So in that case, they got the support, and I ended up being the guest speaker at the AGM that year of this Country Women's Association. as a male. So there we go. I don't think that's happened too often. But the other one is that when we eventually got 4 physically driven out, we did keep the school. There was a school, did remain there, and it was the end of the government after that. It was just a process of sort of struggling on until the next election, then falling over. But the kids that we taught, because we run it, because they saw it as their school and they put in, when they went to other schools the next year, they were up to 2 years ahead of the other kids. And that was a great lesson. That imagine if you had an education system that was run by their community, by the teachers, local community, by parents, and they determined what happened. The kids were involved as well. How much more could be done in terms of education? That takes us back to culture as well.
Yeah. Totally agree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, is there any more further discussion on this one, or otherwise we can move to the next chapter?
Yep. No,
All
I'm
right.
good.
Yep. All right. Well, what we'll do, we'll go on the next chapter. It's about labour policy. First, we'll kick it off with Helen. Then we'll go with Joe, yourself, Nate, and then me. We'll keep reading through. So, Helen, do you want to kick it off?
So we're on to chapter 11 about labour policy. We defend the right to work, the right at work, and the right after work, as well as universal social security, which allows a decent life for workers. Work must be closely linked to the right to life, development of the person, respect for their dignity, and well-being of their family nucleus, so that they constitute solid pillars that sustain a just and equitable society. Work is not only a right, but a duty of the person, and its protection must be in charge of the state. 7 out of 10 Peruvians are informal in employment and do not enjoy any rights. The activities with the greatest capacity to generate employment are not promoted by the state, such as agriculture and industry. However, it is obsessed with promoting mining when in reality it only employs less than 1% of the EAP. Trade unionism and socialism. Freedom of association must be exercised without restrictions, promoting their free affiliation with responsibility, and the organisation must become an arm of the production and productivity of the company, since only to that extent that the company is successful will working conditions improve for the employees, workers, through collective bargaining. Forms of participation of union leaders must be established in the different government instances. Labour policy must raise worker morale, workers' solidarity with the interest of the people and the nation, oriented towards the working class becoming an element with influence on the state. Effort should be directed towards defending job stability, seeking gender labour equity, promoting remuneration in accordance with basic needs, improving working conditions, occupational health and safety, expanding coverage of the social security, promoting the training of workers, establishing effective means to democratise labour representation and the resolution of labour disputes, and postulates that the United Left had already raised. Union leaders must be trained to understand the economic functioning of the state. It is not the same to claim a transnational than the state. Correa explained that when income is disputed to private capital, the shareholder is affected. But when it is disputed income to the state, that affects society. In the first case, it legitimately decreases the profitability of shares. In the second, the books for our children, the medicines for our family, the roads for our people are illegitimately diminished. Joe, your shot. Joe, you're on mute.
About that, I'm trying to speak on mute. On labour rights, the scarcity of paid employment promotes conditions that are taken advantage of to reduce or ignore the acquired rights of workers, reaching the extreme, if not being paid on the minimum vital remuneration for working hours that long exceed 8 hours a day. No labour laws should be restricted or abolished. On the contrary, we must abolish all forms of evasion of corporate labour responsibility, such as labour outsourcing, services, fixed or indeterminate term contracts, hourly work, dismissal of companies, pregnant women, puerperal women, and mothers with children under 1 year of age, guaranteeing them a decent job. The obligation of the socialist state must extend to concern about underemployment and precarious employment. Human trafficking. It undoubtedly constitutes a threat to the state and must therefore be fought energetically. The experience of the sudden Venezuelan immigration to the country showed that the neoliberal state is a promoter of trafficking. Because migrants work more than 8 hours a day, they receive a third of the minimum wage, without the right to social security, without compensation for time of services, without the right to motherhood and schooling, among others, where the only beneficiary is the private sector. On child exploitation, our country has the highest rate in the continent of children and adolescents who work, reaching an alarming sum of 1,274,100, which constitutes a 21.8% of children and adolescents working in our country. According to the ILO, as of 2019, most of the exploitation is rural, 88%, and occurs in agricultural fields and livestock activities, 58%, followed by retail trade, 12%, itinerant work, 8%, and cleaning, 2%. The socialist state must abolish all types of child labour as an expression of justice and fight against exploitation. So we take its eradication as a priority, strongly challenging it, condemning to people and businesses who exploit and commercialise under this criminal modality.
Labour compensation. There is no clear policy on remuneration. We are the only Latin American country that does not have a labour code, even if it has some labour legislation. So it is urgent to draft it in consensus with the government, professional associations and workers. As a result of this anarchy, there are officials who earn more than the President of the Republic, who earns 15,500 soles. For example, the President of the Supreme Court earns 47,000 soles. The President of the Central Reserve Bank earns 41,600 soles. The President of the Superintendency of Banks, SPS, earns 41,600 soles. The Comptroller General of the Republic earns 33,100 soles. The Ministers of State earn 30,000 soles. The Superintendent of Sunat earns 25,000 soles. The Superintendent of Sunafil earns 15,600 soles. Likewise, the holders of Sunas, Susalud, Uske, Indecopi, Osipetel, Ositran, I don't know how to pronounce that, sorry. Congressmen, magistrates of the judicial power, magistrates of the public ministry, members of the constitutional court, have base salaries of 15,600 soles, while the remuneration minimum vital RMB is 930 soles for the Peruvian working class. The freezing of salaries in the country responds to the absence of industrialization, the absence of state companies, the increase in external and internal debt, and the accumulating nature of the state that refuses to redistribute the patrimony generated by the Peruvian working class. The socialist state is obliged to honour the social debt of all sectors that have so far been postponed by forcing them to an unnecessary judicialization of an inalienable right. Considering that the profits of a company are not the product of individual work, but of collective work, Correa argues that the salaries of the employers should be multiples of the wages of the workers, thus a businessman can earn very well, but will pay his worker less qualified, not less than 20 times his own salary. Dave?
National Pension System, SNP, and Private Pension System, SPP. The AFP, Pension Fund Administrator, it is a form of modern slavery. Well, hang on. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's right. The pension fund is a form of modern slavery, close to human trafficking. As private companies belonging to the SPP, the neoliberal state negotiated with them the delivery of a captive market without risk of loss, forcing the worker to contribute to these entities without much opportunity to choose another. Without any permission, the AFPs introduce the money raised in the stock exchanges, and any profitability is always distributed, benefiting from the best percentages, and on the contrary, any loss is always fully charged to the workers. Sounds familiar? We question that for any work claim, it is mandatory to have joined an AFP. Our position is to strengthen the SNP and gradually eliminate the SPP, since the latter has a lucrative purpose by charging percentages of up to 30% just for managing the contributions, clearly a robbery, delivering miserable pensions. With all certainty, if pensioners save their money in any bank, even with low rates, they would earn much more, guaranteeing better care in the face of old age, death and disability. Right to work for the disabled. People with disabilities are ignored and discriminated against by capitalist society. We consider that in the right to work, this discrimination is ignoble, which is why it must be specially protected sector in socialism, guaranteeing working conditions that promote their training and access to fair remuneration. Sectors that guarantee mass work. The socialist state must generate employment through the industrialisation of the country and modernisation of the agricultural sector, among others, to guarantee well-being of 65% of Peruvians directly and indirectly. In addition, consolidating agriculture means security in the face of an imminent foreign food blockade by declaring that character of the state. Wow. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of, actually, when I was reading it, I was actually quite when we're going through that. There was a lot of things. Yes, things do sound familiar there as well in some aspects. It just shows you how just basically even you can have the best law under capitalism, but still they'll find ways to exploit you ruthlessly one way or the other. And it's showing, well, under socialism, this is what must happen. And when I was just reading that little last bit about, I think it's to do with their pensions and private pension system, national pension system, that I've seen with, especially people with private superannuation funds and all that, well, the retail funds, but how many exorbitant fees they charge, and people don't see them at all. And also too, what I'm seeing is like even the pension itself here in Australia. I mean, it's becoming further and further out of reach, but still, if you are eligible for it, it's still not very good. And so it's sort of like you're in a no-win situation here. When you do retire, basically there might be a forcing position is, oh well, you work till the day you jump in the coffin, basically, and that's what they're basically looking to try and do. Extend the retirement age now at 67, but look to have in 70. Then what's next? 72, 75. So yeah, work till you drop. And I think it's refreshing what they're saying is, no, we've got to do something about this and just put a grinding halt. You should have reached retired at a decent at a respectable age and have a fruitful retirement. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's an example there with the human trafficking thing where it says it mentions the conditions of migrants being very much more exploitative than other people in the country. We have as I work in the construction industry, I've seen a specific example where the traffic controllers predominantly all come from overseas, and when it comes to that kind of work, it's very often maligned in the media as saying, oh, these people earn something ridiculous like $120,000 a year, and people are outraged when they hear that, because they're like, oh my God, how dare they? They do nothing. They just sit there and with signs and stuff like that. But the reality is, the way they've come to that figure, the 120,000 magical figure, is by extrapolating the hourly rate that they're on and then pretending that they work for like a 36 to 40 hour week. But they don't. These people are overwhelmingly casual workers who are on 0-day contracts, 0-hour contracts, which means that they could be called at literally any hour of the day or night to say, oh, well, you got to go, you got to be at the other side of the city at 5 o'clock next morning, whether you like it or not. and they have no choice but to go. Otherwise, if they say no and knock it back, which they can do, they will reduce their odds of being called back the next time. So really, they're living by a thread, these people. And, like they can, the corporate world sort of pretends and waves their hand at it and says, oh, well, they're paid really well hourly. Well, that's okay, that may be true. But the problem is it's not enough working hours, and it's not a dependable income for them to be able to live a proper stress-free life. So I never really thought of that as human trafficking, but that is a perfect terminology to use for that. Because, what else is it? When it comes down to it, the real meat and potatoes of it is that you are bringing these people in, enticing them with these hourly well-paid jobs. But really, when you look at it, it's sort of like a bait and switch thing. When they finally are in here, they can't earn enough or have no working hours to be able to aggregate a decent living. Plus, on top of that, just like it says here in what we've read, they don't benefit from our health system. They don't have maternity leave. They don't have annual leave. They don't have any other benefits that any other working person has in Australia. So that's actually a very good point.
And I think actually an early interesting point. It's like when the term human trafficking, okay, it's been associated a lot with sex trade and prostitution, etc. Women sold into slavery that way. But I think we're also too human trafficking. It branches out into all industries now. About 6 years ago, it's when I was in the Pilbara works, myself and the union officials, we sat down and did a course by a couple of women who actually work in this field to expose human trafficking. And for example, this was a big eye-opener. But so you can look at the cleaners in a big shopping centre, say, for example, Karratha Shopping Centre. Yes, they're all migrant workers. But you realise that actually they've been trafficked there, not necessarily kidnapped and trafficked there, but because of their dire consequences of their home country. Being absolute bubbles of poverty. They're promised everything. Sure, they'll sign the dotted line. As soon as they get there, they get their passports taken off them, and they're just paid, and their money's kept from them. Or a lot, they might be kept in substandard accommodation, etc. And if they dare speak up, they're either get basically reported to authorities and they get sent back home with no money. But also, too, on the top of that, their families are threatened back in their own home country as well. And what we're seeing, what was also at that time, and it'll be a lot more rife, especially after they start allowing more international flights back into Australia again, because one thing they want to do is bring back, migrant labour again, in the sense of we're temporary labour. The fact is that these people are going to be ruthlessly exploited even more by criminal syndicates, the whole lot. And this thing's right out of control. And what got me is, especially during the early starts of COVID last year, they were screaming out for skilled people in the regional areas. Well, skilled people, for workers to work in agriculture. They're picking fruit and vegetables, seasonal workers. Now, they're bringing in from the Pacific Islands and other areas. Now, I don't mind about being here. We're great. We've got a nice multicultural society. But the fact is, these people are only here temporarily. They're paid as low as bare minimal. They might be okay in that, and they go back. And people who are saying, and actually farmers and big property owners saying, well, we do not want to employ local labour because they cost too much. And there was one vineyard, they couldn't get any workers, and there was plenty of workers to pick their grapes. It was just in the nearby town. They're looking for work. They're out of work. No, not going to employ them. And I'm just thinking, well, bugger you, go and pick your own grapes in. As well. So it's like the agricultural sector here in this country is one of the most ruthlessly exploited industries there for low wages, etc. And I know the unions, such as the United Workers Union, they've been doing a lot of good work in regional Victoria as well. I believe the AWU's running a case now somewhere as well for protections for those workers in the rural sector. And most of them, visa workers, have been basic form of traffic here. But it looks very legal on paper, but in fact it's not. And you sort of do further digging.
Yeah, a lot of that. On that case, they're complaining at the moment because COVID's not allowing labour. But there's been in other industries as well. In the meat industry, the abattoirs they've done the same thing. And some of their manufacturing sweatshops I remember a place years ago, they employed mainly migrant, a lot of students up there. They employed them on trial basis, inverted commas, not as temporary, and then sacked them all a few months later when because they were in a situation where they were learning to do the job, so they're only getting a fraction of the wage. Well, the place ended up being unionised, so that killed that off. But it's
well, you're frozen up there, Joe.
Yeah, I think we've lost Joe. So while Joe's frozen,
I'm coming back. I hope. Am I there?
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, okay. What was I going to say? It's also that we've got between 30 and 40% of the workforce is casualised. So they're cheap labour as well, and it's parallel in some ways, not severe, but there's some pattern that's familiar. Peru document, but we've also got the attacks on people on social security benefits that are coming in order basically to force them into being a source of cheap labour as well. I'm talking about, increasing the age pensioners to some extent, single parents, people on disability, goes right across the board. And there's a horrendous thing going on there at the moment because a lot of people, particularly people with disability and single parents, are really, really being pushed. And they're being pushed onto unemployment benefits, which are a lot less. Particularly if you're a single parent and you've got a couple of kids in the house, it's not enough to survive on. So there's a lot of people facing not only not having enough food, but actually facing the possibility of homeless.
yeah.
These are practices that need to be outlawed and punished harshly by those who practice them.
Right. I was last night. Joe, you might have been on there. I'm not too sure. Helen, you were on there.
You got feedback, Dave. You got a lot of feedback.
Someone might have to put themselves on mute. Hang on. I'll just put you on a. What happened? I don't know if you two were on the VTHC hook up last night, the Zoom meeting. Luke Hilikari and we had Michelle O'Neill from the ACTU on there doing the talk. And a big concern, they put a survey out amongst everyone. I think it was over like 120, 150 participants there. One of the big concerns is casualisation. Now, what happened early this year, the federal parliament, federal government moved a bill. There was a whole range of industrial agenda. Most of it got knocked back in the Senate, except for one part, and that's to do with casuals conversion. Now, it was accepted with the support of Pauline Hanson's One Nation and some other nasty little reactionary politician there. Basically, currently, or before then, you had, under the awards and law, you had after 6 months continual employment, someone who's casually employed has got the right to convert to full time. Well, what this one legislation allow through now, it's 12 months continuous service if you wish to elect to become full time, but it's also up to the employer's discretion even more if he wants to or not. And that was just in light of a win the union, the Mining Energy Division, the CFMU, won a few years ago against Workpac, a labour hire company in a coal mine up north for a long-term casual worker working labour hire. They actually managed to win back all his annual leave and sick leave, etc., and other entitlements that full-time employees are entitled to. Simple reason being because he didn't fit the role of being a casual, but they've been using it and ruthlessly exploiting it to such a degree where people have been casual for X amount of years and not getting any of the entitlements of full-time workers employed at. And that's what they're trying to come back here. And I love this little one on labour rights when they're saying about labour outsourcing services, fixed and indeterminate term contractors, hourly work dismissal companies, etc. And I thought I can relate to all that. We've seen all this outsourcing years ago and casualisation and that. And the current federal government, but I'm not saying Labor's going to be any better either, but saying, oh no, let's further have a casualised workforce. That will lead to a great economic recovery. I don't think so. While people are feeling the pump and that, and not going to speak up, they're going to be further pushed into the ground. So it just shows. I mean, this is good, this document, because there's a lot of stuff we can relate to here, and it shows a contrast what Peru's trying to do under a socialist government, where under a capitalist imperialist government like we've got here. Oh no, we've got to put some of the most anti-worker legislations, anti-working class legislations through to make life matters worse for working people.
Yeah, and I think we always have to remember what the aim of bringing in migrant labour and the human trafficking side of things is, that ultimately what it leads to is the falling rate of wages. It's the constant drive to push down workers' wages and exploit people even further, and that's of course why they want to have people from single mums being forced to go out to work, and pensioners being forced to go out to work. And of course there's a real problem with it. I mean, they become a reserve army of labour, which then allows for wages to be driven down to next to nothing. But the real problem is that there is no work. We're going through a computer technology revolution, and we are going to be seeing more and more technology coming into the workplace. And where's that going to leave workers? You've got a reserve army. They don't need as many people on the job, so we'll drive down wages even further. And that's in the next coming years, I think we're going to see a reduction in. We're going to see a huge increase in unemployment and a reduction in wages and conditions, I'd say. Something obviously that we're going to have to fight back, against. And I think this is something that's really important and they mention it in this document as well, is that, the union leaders need to understand the economy, and they need to be trained to understand the economic functioning of the state. And not only for the socialist state, does the union leaders need to be trained, but our union leaders need to be trained in understanding the capitalist state, and they need to understand how this comes about. And it might be enough to protect workers' wages that are at work, but they're going to become irrelevant if they don't start to look at the unemployed and see that reserve army of labour as a force that they need to build solidarity with. Because it's going to be more and more a case of where there are no workers, and more workers unemployed than there will be actually employed. So I think that's going to be interesting in the next few years.
Yeah, Nate, did you want to say something? Oh, hang on, Joe.
No, not for now. Not for now. No, sorry. No. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I just what Helen said about this sort of replacement of workers by technology. There's an incredible contradiction there. And they can't do it. That's what they're aiming at. And the simple reason is the values created through labour. Right? They actually need workers to be doing the work to actually create labour. If they don't, if labour is not expended, then there is no value, there is no profit at the end of the day. And it actually brings them undone. And I think at the moment, the great contradiction in capitalism in Australia and in other countries is this contradiction between the capitalisation of the economy and the falling of the rate of value. That's actually leading to economic crisis. That is the problem we've got at the moment. It's not COVID-19. COVID made it worse, added another element to it, but it's this contradiction that's been going on for half a century now, and it's intensifying at the moment. And at the moment, if they continue along the same road, they will destroy the goose that lays its their golden egg. Economically, but also socially, they will cause a social reaction against it.
Yeah. And I think actually when I was on that one was what we're seeing here in Australia, I mean, Oh, look, when COVID came along, I mean, looking at this, I mean, capitalism comes to show it cannot deal with the crisis. It was a capitalism was already in crisis, and while it was in crisis, it couldn't definitely deal with something like COVID, even if it wanted to. So it hasn't been able to do so. And it's more or less, all right, let's get everyone back to work as soon as possible, back to work, blah, 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 and trying to create value again. But because that's the golden rules, Labor creates value. It's otherwise, something by itself is completely worthless. And I think that's just what I wanted to tie it to, is as well when we're talking about trade unionism and that. I think it's, in some ways, a very interesting point. Wages and conditions are certainly important. That's probably what unions were originally set up for. But also, I think we need to get back the ideology of working class and class struggle back into it again, and based on class struggle again, and not just on merely the next EBA or the next industry wins and all that, which are important, but and they're lower levels of struggle. They're a form of class struggle, but at the end of the day, that's not what we should actually build that to a political ideological, where it's based on class struggle again. And I like how that was. This is, I could be completely wrong, and I'm happy to prove wrong. But when I was reading this document, I thought that's where they're heading to. That's what they want to develop their unions on, not just strictly just for wages and conditions, but based on class struggle and for social change. And obviously it's been done before here in Australia. I mean, we do have a history of it. It can be done again, obviously under different circumstances compared to what we were years ago. But look, it can be done, and I think it must be done. Oh, Helen, you're on mute. You want to say something? Yep.
Well, I was just going to say, so I think that's a fantastic note to finish it on, because it's
yes.
It's 8:26. Unless somebody's got something else they wanted to say, but I thought that was a very good point, Dave. That it can be done, and we need to do it. And it's,
All right. Well, look, no one else got anything to say. We'll finish it off tonight. I just want to make a big shout out. Thank you to Luke Buckmaster. We need critical thinking. Once again, comrade Pinko, and another guy called himself Hugo Chavez. Yes, welcome aboard. And I actually saw an excellent footage of Hugo Chavez here the other week, actually, by the Latin American Solidarity Network. It was very, very inspiring. But look, just before we finish, I think when we come back in a fortnight, we'll be on chapter 12 about anti-corruption policy, which actually fits in perfectly well what's happening at the moment, talking about a federal ICAC and what's happening with the New South Wales and Victorian governments with various
2 weeks allows a lot of time for things to happen for us to talk about.
Oh yeah, so we've got a lot to cover. I think there'll be a lot more coming out of the woodwork yet. So so that'll be chapter 12 about anti-corruption policy. So that'll be starting there. So look, once again, thank you everyone for participating tonight. Thank you for all the viewers out there. Look, yes, go on.
Sorry, just so that our viewers or people watching this program can follow along with us. The document Peru Libre is available on the internet, so people can read along with us. They can read it beforehand and contribute with it a bit of a discussion. Find it online.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. And look, yes, as I said, if you are watching this or going to watch this later on, please feel to share it far and wide, invite people along to like it. And look, if anyone there, especially other comrades that might be closely watching this at the moment, because there's a few of you watching tonight, look, by all means, shoot me a message, and I'll see if you'd like to be involved in these in the future. So look, we'll finish it off tonight. And I usually just say it on the simple thing as what Karl Marx said all the way back in his day, and so it resonates very loud and clear to this very day. Your fists in the air, workers of all countries unite.
Workers of all countries unite.
So thank you and all the best.
Bye.